within a week of my story coming out in Vanity Fair, a scathing documentary came out in Sweden called The Experiments, which exposed all his medical lies. And it was actually worse than I feared. I mean, watching that documentary was one of the most difficult things I've ever had to do, because it was so obvious that he blatantly used people as human guinea pigs, that he knew, I believe, from the beginning that this thing he was transplanting into them would never work. It was a plastic tube that might as well have been a straw. He knew damn well it wasn't going to work, and he did it anyway. It's just so obvious how reckless this man is and how dangerous he is. And it was the combination of the two things that sort of blew everything up, because now you have these insane, over the top, egregious lies in his personal life, coupled with this evidence that he's been lying in the medical arena. And the two things were what finally blew everything up.
That lane of the story, well covered in all the pieces I mentioned, as disturbing as your piece is the most disturbing.
Oh, it's horrific. It's way worse than what happened to me. I mean, there's just what happened to me is nothing.
But it's a similar pattern. It's a similar pattern if you look at it, right? In well-meaning, earnest, kind people in some turmoil, trusting him. Just trusting him.
People.
Yeah, trusting him to do right by them, to take care of them, to see them through, the most difficult times of their life, wooed by his bedside manner, which we discussed, and his credentials and all of these institutions around him vouching for him. Only in their cases, it was a deadly mistake. And amazingly, there are still some families still believing in him, even after their loved ones died in his care. And I can only think they have to do that just as a self-protection mechanism. Like they just have to say, we didn't put our loved one in the hands of a madman. We did something smart and we took a calculated risk. And as I see the people in like the Netflix documentary wrestling with, no, it's okay. We're still grateful to him. All I can think is that's something other than acceptance.
I believe that too. I think Paolo was very good at convincing the families when patients died that the patients were pioneers, and they would sort of live in history as pioneers who help pave the way for a better medical future. And that's a much nicer thing to think than you put your loved one in the hands of a madman who is reckless and dangerous and a murderer, quite frankly, probably a serial killer. And I think for some of these patients, families, who had been so desperate, and especially Hannah's family, they thought Paolo was the answer to their prayers. They thought he was their last hope. They believed in him. They put so much into that, and they sought him out. And I think that's the other thing. A lot of these people found Dr. Macchiarini on the internet. They did a Google search, and that's how they found him. So, to deal with the death of your loved one, especially a child, and then on top of that, you sought out the person, that probably killed her. I think that's just too much to wrap your head around.
Yep, it would be for me. There's Chris Lyles, whose story is heartbreaking. A 30-year-old man, electrical engineer from Maryland, and he was diagnosed with cancer, but heard of Paolo Macchiarini. And he did the procedure on Chris, and Chris, like all the others who kept that fake trachea in, died. Here's a bit on him from the piece, SOT 3.
We didn't see Paolo that much. He was flying this place, he was flying that place. He had one of his assistants look after Chris.
Is it okay, Chris? Yeah. Don't you try to hold it?
Very soon after surgery, Chris Lyles gained an infection in the airway, so he started to cough enormously hard. This, really, really deep cough. He got mucus clots in the airways. What also happened was he got an infection in this wound. So he had a quite dramatic early post-operative period. But it was a little bit unusual that you get the infection so early on after surgery.
And he had a young daughter, and he
Horrible.
died. And the family
Yeah. And
continues to stand by Paolo.
No, actually, no, not anymore.
Oh,
they
no?
did initially.
Oh.
Yeah, they did. They finally came around and realized, initially they still stood by him, but now, no. Now they know.
Oh.
Yeah.
They were in the Netflix piece sounding like, well, Chris, he was terminal, and so it was a risk we decided to take. But that's interesting. Was it after they saw the compilation of stories, that they realized how Chris fit into the story? Or what do you think did it for them?
I think it just takes time. And I think it's the same for any of the people that Dr. Macchiarini fooled. I mean, we're talking some of the world's most prestigious, esteemed institutions, doctors, scientists. I mean, he pulled the wool over so many people's eyes. It's not just me and the other women in his life. It's not just the patients and their families. I mean, so many people. And I think it's a very, very difficult thing, A, to admit that you got fooled, but B, to wrap your head around the fact that this man who you thought was either the answer to your patient, your loved one dying, or was, in the case of Karolinska at Sweeting, bringing you all kinds of accolades and money and esteem. It's just very difficult to wrap your head around the fact that Dr. Paolo Macchiarini is not who you thought he was, and that he's exactly the opposite of who you thought he was. And I think it just takes time.
And that you may have entrusted your loved one to a madman, to somebody with zero empathy, who may have been a sociopath. The case out of Russia, also disturbing. We've mentioned his contacts there.
Beyond.
This young ballerina whose name was Yulia. He performed her surgery in 2012. And there's a bit of Paolo talking about her in the piece. Young, beautiful. She was not terminal.
No, she did not need this surgery. And she begged him, actually. They actually had a lottery in Russia because he was looking for quote unquote healthy patients to try this procedure on. She had been in a car accident, so she had a hole in her throat. She had a tracheotomy, but she could have lived the rest of her life like that. And she made a video begging Paolo to pick her, and he picked her, tragically.
Here's a bit of Paolo talking about her from the Netflix show, Bad Surgeon.
This is Yulia. When I met Yulia, she was not able to play with her child. It was a very emotional moment for me. And I immediately said, this is the right patient. And I still do not believe that a few days ago she couldn't breathe and talk normally. So she's a little bit afraid of you. So please be very sweet.
I'm not afraid of anyone, she says.
Her
she was
case,
paraded out and around like she was one of his success stories. And as they point out in the piece, it was a lie. And indeed, she died.
Yeah, and not only died, but they died horrible deaths. I mean, this plastic tube that was coated in the patient's own stem cells was literally rotting inside their throats. So Yulia's mother talks about the fact that she smelled horrifically because this thing was rotting. She smelled like rotting fish because this thing was rotting inside her throat. And then they suffocated to death because this thing disintegrated and rotted in their throats. It's not only did they die, but it's like a torturous death. It's awful.
And he kept doing it. Credit card rewards like cash back can empower families with extra savings while they deal with the rising price of groceries and gas. But our sponsor, the Electronic Payments Coalition, says some DC politicians are partnering with corporate megastores to take the cash back rewards away from families during skyrocketing inflation. Specifically, they say the Durbin-Marshall credit card bill would take billions from American families, lining corporate pockets instead. Learn more at electronicpaymentscoalition.org and see for yourself if you want to protect credit card rewards and tell DC politicians to oppose the Durbin-Marshall credit card bill. That's electronicpaymentscoalition.org. Hey, thanks so much for watching. If you like what you just saw, hit the subscribe button for more clips and full episodes.